Hello, I'm Alexa Bomazovic, Project Manager at Adrianople Group, and today I will be talking to Ghaidaa Hetou, who is the founder of iStrategic LLC. Ghaidaa is an academic and researcher focusing on the Middle East and North Africa, also known as the MENA region. Ghaidaa's work focuses on security, foreign policy and political economy. She writes on grand strategy, middle powers, geopolitics, and political risk analysis in the MENA region. She is an adjunct professor at Rutgers University, teaching at the United Nations and Global Policy Studies Master's Program. So, Ghaidaa, I want to welcome you onto the Adrianople Podcast. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. How are you doing?
Very good. How about yourself, Alexa?
Doing very well, thank you. So we've invited Ghaidaa onto the podcast to talk with us about the Chinese involvement in the MENA region, which means the Middle East and Northern Africa region. So I'd like to just dive right into the first question, and that would be, what is the interest of China in general and the Belt and Road in particular within the MENA region? And what developments inside the MENA region have we seen since 2013 when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced?
Absolutely. First, thank you, Alexa, for having me. Happy to be on your podcast. This is indeed the question of the time, and there are many aspects to this question, so please allow me to give a bit of a summary of China's BRI at the beginning. Of course, as you and your audience know, the Belt and Road Initiative was announced in 2013. It is China's transnational infrastructure project that will strengthen China's connectivity across Eurasia. The plan includes 65 countries with a population of 4.4 billion, 62% of the world's population. These 65 countries have a combined GDP of $23 trillion. And in the words of President Xi, BRI should focus on the fundamental issue of development, release of the growth potential of various countries, and achieve economic integration and interconnected development and deliver benefits to all. Now, just a quick note that the BRI benefits China as well. It expands China's export market. The promotion of RMB, example, is issuing bonds in RMB to raise capital for the infrastructure project. Streamlining tariffs, regulation, and transportation costs, especially through the establishment of special economic zones in partnership with China. Most importantly, the BRI will solve China's excess capacity problem by utilizing its excess savings. And since the domestic infrastructure boom has slowed down in China, the state-owned enterprises such as construction, steel, IT, and cement companies can be put to work in overseas infrastructure projects. Chinese companies who work on BRI projects have access to easy credit, allowing them to outbid competing foreign companies in host countries. Now, going back to your question, MENA is a crucial connecting region in the BRI project between East Asia and Europe. China's interest in MENA as part of the BRI project can be summarized in 5 categories: reviving historical trade routes and cultural reach into the region, minimizing reliance on maritime choke points, especially Malacca Strait in South China Sea for oil shipments and trade, specifically the CPEC economic corridor, part of the BRI that runs 3,000 kilometers from China's Kashgar to Pakistan's Gwadar. And this corridor includes pipelines, as you know, railways, highways, cables, and energy projects. China's interest in MENA as part of the BRI includes influencing the development trajectory of China's future markets, especially through partnering and establishing, as we mentioned, special economic zones. Proximity to China's main oil producers, while Russia holds the top spot, Saudi Arabia comes in second. So, it is hard to imagine a BRI without MENA being integrated into the project, but compared to other MENA-wide development initiatives, such as the New Middle East and more broadly, American and European democratization and economic reform project, for example, the BRI offers the following alternatives to local governments in need: infrastructure project, rebuilding, collaborative energy and IT projects, including high-tech surveillance and satellite technologies without reform preconditions. Of course, local governments translate that as a non-interference in domestic affairs. China continues to work with nations that are struggling in their development path, thereby empowering central government, despite them registering low on the United Nations Human Development Index, for example. China already developed a practical path to cooperating with state apparatuses in South Asia, including Pakistan, Afghanistan, and it has been successful in Iran as well. The United States as a global power has left legacies in MENA. Since the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the late regime change in Libya in 2011, China is presenting itself as an alternative or competing trading partner and support of local development. But China is still hesitant to back up its mega projects with adequate diplomatic and military power. In other words, the recent BRICS oil fields attack in Saudi Arabia and Khurais are as much a security question for Saudi Arabia as they are for China. In general, both Russia and China are increasingly perceived as loyal allies in the region, which is, I believe, a direct outcome of Russia's intervention in Syria.
I think that clears up the question excellently, and this would be a great way to segue into the next question, which is you had mentioned that projects that China has undertaken in the MENA region sound very interesting. You mentioned they're not officially regarded as something that affects local governments. So the question that I'd like to seg into would be, what is the public sentiment of peoples and governments in the MENA region towards the Chinese involvement?
This is a great question, Alexa. Of course, it is hard to see a trace of the historical memory when China and the Middle East dominated international trade. Of course, as you know, prior to the 16th century, meaning before this monopoly was broken, when the alternative route to East Asia was discovered by the Portuguese explorers in 1488, when they sailed around the southern tip of Good Hope in Africa and from there reached the Chinese shores by 1514. Contemporary sentiments in the region see Chinese interest and influence as a vital alternative. I'll explain the sentiment through three examples from Egypt, Iraq, and the Gulf region. First, all MENA countries have established their respective China business associations, and I believe they also are called trade relations offices. And another noticeable pattern is that trade volume with China has accelerated in the past 5 years. So for Egypt, for example, China's investment in Egypt have reached nearly $7 billion. 90% of that was received in the past 5 years alone. The trade volume reached $13.8 billion in 2018, and Egypt does indeed strive to be China's #1 trading partner in Africa. There are approximately 1,200 Chinese companies operating in Egypt, especially in IT and its economic zones, providing around 40 to 41,000 jobs, in addition to building skyscrapers in Egypt's new administrative capital. I think there's no coincidence that in the past 5 years, China has poured in close to $7 billion in Egypt's economy. When President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took over in 2013, there was real confusion in the US and EU on how to deal with the new leadership and its strict security measures. Of course, as everyone has heard, there were accusations of human rights abuses, but there were two countries waiting to enter the Egyptian market en masse, Russia and China. And the timing and investment numbers speak for themselves. In Iraq, it's an interesting story. Because of the regime change that took place in 2003 and the assumption that the rebuilding efforts would be spearheaded by the United States and its allies, of course, it would be unfair to not mention governing difficulties, corruption, and oil production interruptions that happen in Iraq, of course. But yet, after 15 years, we have an Iraq that still lacks the availability of basic services such as water and electricity, in addition to high unemployment. And in the last 2 years, the Iraqi government was planning for a strategic partnership with China, and it just started to take shape. For Iraq's particular 2030 vision, they needed a strategic partner that had the capacity, ability for accelerated implementation, execution, low cost, and technology advancement, and China became that partner of choice. In the recent, as you probably heard, the recent visit by Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi into China, the Iraq Prime Minister stated in his address to his Chinese counterparts that oil was used for war in the past. Now we want to use oil to rebuild Iraq. The first agreement included just recently $10 billion in investment for the infrastructure and energy projects in Iraq. And in most Chinese mega projects in the region, there's an emphasis on tech transfers and collaboration in training local workers and investing in the private sector. In the GCC countries, the six Persian Gulf countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, Chinese interests are even more visible and welcomed. From 2000 to 2018, China GCC trade grew from $10 billion to $150 billion. Between 2005 and 2018, China's FDI in GCC countries reached $90 billion, with the UAE and Qatar establishing RMB currency swaps to support Chinese firms' projects in the region. So you can see there's a long-term vision here. And the UAE's RMB clearance house, for example, was used to clear over 7 billion in transaction in just 2018 alone. Of course, Chinese banks established their presence in GCC countries as well. Now, the Chinese defense and security collaboration is more on the quieter side, which might become more visible through military exercises, joint military exercises, and high-level meetings between defense officials. To touch on the street and public level perception of Chinese presence in the MENA region, I can recall a recent 2018 Zogby and Pew Research Center survey asked respondents in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia about which country poses the biggest threat to your country. And surprisingly, partially surprisingly, it was Israel and US took the first two spots. On a question of who do you have, do you have a favorable view of China? And another question stated, how much confidence do you have in the Chinese president? And yet another, does China respect the personal freedoms of its people? And the answers seem to be in the positive for China in recent years. Now, another interesting question would be, does the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, where they constitute 40% of the province and they number about 9 million people who are Muslim minority of Turkic origin, have an effect of how people in MENA view China? Surprisingly, not really. Especially when main countries such as Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia have not made it an issue and have basically implicitly exonerated Chinese leadership from discriminating against this minority population. But on the other side, the perceived mistreatment may find traction among religious and radical Muslim communities in the region and in South and Central Asia.
So what you mentioned regarding the long-term vision by China of being involved in the MENA region is quite interesting, because the Chinese are known as very prospective investors that don't invest into unsecure and dangerous areas. So what I'd be quite interested in learning about is, could you give us more detail about Iraq and similar ex-conflict zones and current conflict zones that China seems to be investing in currently? Is this a sign of de-escalation in the future because of the Chinese development, or is Chinese development following de-escalation? Could you give us a few more details on that?
Absolutely. So this is a fantastic question, Alexa, as it resembles all the other questions. But the answer to this one could be understood in two ways. One, that the supply chain competition between the United States and China and competition acquiring government contracts is definitely part of MENA's reality in the coming years. Market size, the axis will continue to readjust between US and China and their allies in the region. The rules of the game have changed. And countries in the region understand very well that they have an option outside of the US sphere. And that includes countries that are now on the verge of exiting the civil war period, such as hopefully Libya and Syria and so forth. So prominent countries have already expressed in words and action their pivot to Russia and China. We will witness a threshold. Now, will we witness a threshold where China need to secure oil access, for example, might prompt Chinese military mobilization in the region in the future? Maybe. But since the US has become a net exporter of oil, this attempt at replacing the US in a strategic location as part of the Carter Doctrine, as you know, might be a call for a coercive measure, war, or sabotage. Now, on the flip side for that question, Alexa, we can look at it a different way. BRI could be seen as a de-escalating escalating element. And let me make a case for this. The recent Qiq and Khurais attacks in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia on September 14th, which shut down about half of Saudi oil production, which in turn presents roughly 5% of global oil production. The initial statements from Saudi Arabia Authority and the United States pointed towards Iran to be the source of the attack, either directly or indirectly. But yet, striking Iran in a retaliation is not an easy option. Besides the obvious second and third order effects on where Iran might retaliate and so forth, there's the fact that China is heavily involved and invested in Iran. Just a week earlier from the attacks, China has further incorporated Iran in its BRI with a total investment of about $400 billion. But this time, China has sent 5,000 security personnel to Iran. So the option of a military strike on Iran is quite a gamble for all involved. In this sense, China's multilateral economic and investment reach in the region is changing military engagement calculus. There are a number of studies that have shown that economic integration does change foreign policy options. Now, the other question could be, is BRI contributing to greater internal stability and better governance? That is an important question and an extension to your excellent question, and that remains to be seen and needs to be monitored. We know in Pakistan, for example, and Sri Lanka, the debt from the BRI loans have prompted the government to request assistance from the IMF and the Gulf states.
So would it be fair to say that China has geoeconomic incentives to keep peace in the Middle East as much as possible?
Absolutely, there's no question about it. It's heavily involved. It is planning to be more integrated and involved. And like I said, MENA is a crucial section of the success of the whole BRI project. So it is invested in the security and stability of the region, yes.
So the next question that I'd like to pass on to, and this was a very interesting segment for myself personally, because I like to focus on the military and geoeconomic interoperability of this whole issue. And the next question I'd like to ask is, what are some of the underreported stories in this entire development that you and the folks over at iStrategic believe that people should be focusing on?
I think there are a number of them, and this is really like a kind of a foresight, trying to figure out what the mapping, what the blueprint in the future will look like. The underreported aspect of the development, I would say, is the fierce competition and low-cost, high-tech alternative that the Chinese firms are offering. This is basic number one, which is they are easily replacing competing offers from Western firms who are operating under budget constraints. Most Chinese companies who operate in MENA are granted government backing, either through easy access to loans or through direct government support. Another aspect that is kind of underreported is the impact of transnational Islamist terror groups, especially after they regrouped from their jihad in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Libya. This is a kind of a loose, underreported piece. They could regroup in Central Asia, and that would be a significant problem for BRI. The Chinese prefer to work quietly with a low profile in the region. They do have linguistic skills thanks to free Arabic teaching channels on China TV and other skill building initiatives. They are still behind on cultural preferences and soft power norms in the region, where Western pop culture and taste is still preferred. Here's a weak link that Western businesses still have an advantage in and may have an easier time building goodwill in the host country if they have, of course, the capabilities to mitigate risk and work on sustaining their operations for the long term. Now, here's a little connection with development policy. The slow expansion of BRI in MENA might give UN Sustainable Development Goals and general CSR and ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance, a boost in the region if Western businesses are willing to integrate a development and social responsibility-oriented additions to their business models. Usually Chinese and Russian companies integrate local development in one way or another. So competing firms have to match, if not exceed. And if they want to be, of course, if they want to be a player in this evolving market.
What you just mentioned about the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., is quite interesting to me, specifically regarding the special economic zone developments that China has been focusing on within the BRI framework. And what I'd like to ask next is, do you think that there's any kind of interoperability that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to gain from special economic zones within the Middle East, where experiments in regulation are going to show leadership to the rest of the region in following the SDGs and developing on and delivering on them?
Absolutely. I mean, you of course are aware of the United Nations Global Compact organization, which is fiercely committed to joining the corporate culture with SDG goals and integrating them into their bottom line and how they understand CSR and so forth. So the special economic zones and would be a great realm where those play out, and especially in regions where they really need to upgrade their, reform their institutions, corporate governance, improving the efficiency of the public sector, increasing their private sector, and so forth. So I see a lot of opportunity, and I'm extremely optimistic about the special economic zones, because this is exactly the free and flexible environment where those integration between development goals can be a part and parcel of the corporate world.
So one of the sustainable development goals, if I'm not mistaken, is related to education and empowering locals. And what I'm quite interested in is you mentioned some of China's initiatives into soft skills and that part of goodwill building in
Yes.
the MENA region. And what I'd like to know is, for our listeners, what do people need to understand about the MENA region and how it interoperates with the West on one end and
Mhm.
China on the other before they do business in the MENA region?
Absolutely. Companies are usually concerned with financial and economic feasibility studies and other market parameters, access to credit and attaining permits and so forth, which of course are important. What tends to be less focused on are the other type of risks that are important in developing countries in general and MENA countries in particular. And just to segue to your comments is exactly the developmental needs that are part of the and are on the minds of on the decision makers who are granting contracts and so forth by government institutions in the region. So in general, developing countries have a different operational environment concerning the regulatory institutions, adherence to contracts, institutional responsiveness to disputes, for example, and complaints, in addition, of course, to their respective political and socioeconomic environments. In MENA, these non-market risks are, as they are called, are multifold. And unfortunately, Business Environment Index does not give a complete picture and does not account for warning signs. So what companies need to take into account is before doing business or investing into Middle Eastern countries and economies is to investigate the political and socioeconomic risks and warning signs in the country of interest, and really understand the needs, the developmental needs, and how the local government host country is collaborating with the United Nations regarding the development goals. Sector-specific risks with regards to policy, regulatory, and budgetary changes, local competition, affiliated political and cultural patterns are all significant for comprehensive market entry planning. MENA is changing. There's a sense of nationalism where each country is focusing more on its economic development, and kind of the past transnational identities of pan-Arabism or pan-Islamism have receded quite a bit. The enacted national economic policies from, for example, as you mentioned, Iraq, the 2030 vision, and others from welcoming FDI to establishing special economic zones and rebuilding efforts after civil wars. And we have quite some countries that will be in at that stage in the near future. These all carry tremendous opportunity, not just for profit and corporate considerations, but also for development and CSR. Hence, a clear understanding of the political and socioeconomic environment and how to build corporate capabilities to mitigate these risks become a priority before doing business or investing in MENA.
It's excellent that you should mention that, because at this point I'd quite like to mention your firm, iStrategic, which focuses on exactly the kind of studies that you mentioned. So before people do business in the Middle East, it definitely pays to know what kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic risks are taking place in various regions. So could you tell us more about how iStrategic helps people like our listeners in doing business in regions such as MENA?
Yeah, of course. iStrategic specializes in the MENA region, and we have a well-established network of associates here in the US and in the region that have the local expertise, language, culture, and socioeconomic background, and are professionally trained in data science, policy analysis, regulatory and due diligence, security, and sector-specific expertise. We have a multi-layered approach to risk analysis. After initial consultation with the company regarding their objectives and their risk tolerance, we start with a detailed risk assessment that relies on quantitative analysis matched against a complex system investigation. Now, what do I mean by that? Political and socioeconomic contexts need to be understood as a complex system of interrelated factors that are nonlinear. Hence, are not represented accurately through probabilistic modeling only. So understanding the context is key to make better sense of the quant analysis. The next step is taking this information and reveal patterns to construct a scenario analysis from the most likely scenarios to the least likely. And for each, what the best precaution and course of action needs to be for the corporation. Just a side note, the International Society of Risk Analysis is in the process of establishing quality controls on risk analysis. And at iStrategic, we follow these risk analysis quality guidelines. I and others have contributed to the formation and drafting of these risk analysis quality protocols. The end result here are proactive strategic risk mitigation strategies that would be very useful for companies operating in a fast-changing environment like MENA. After this step, if it is required or needed, a representative from iStrategic could accompany a corporate delegation to the MENA country and help in the initial discussions, introductions, and negotiations.
Understood. I think that's a very helpful service to have in the MENA region, which is unfortunately quite well known for being complex and unpredictable as far as doing business goes.
Absolutely.
So, Ghaidaa, thank you very much for explaining to us how to best understand the situation in the MENA region, but also for those who don't have businesses that are interested in doing their business in the MENA region, for somebody who's just academically curious or otherwise interested in the region, what are some good books or resources or even thought leaders to consult about the development of BRI and geopolitical development in China?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think I remember visiting a library or just browsing through a bookstore without having the China section populated with people and interested inquiries and discussions. So what comes to mind when it comes to very good publications on China, I can firstly mention Henry Kissinger's book on China. And of course, you and your audience know that he has an intimate understanding of Chinese policy from his days as the US Secretary of State and the detente policy towards China in the early 1970s, I believe. There's also The Future is Asian by Parag Khanna. Excellent book. And of course, When China Rules the World by Martin Jakes. I'm sure there are many, many others, and I apologize if there's some kind of famous publication out there that I did not mention, but they are all excellent, and I only hear quite a bit of praise to the excellent publications on China out there.
Excellent. That answers all of our questions. This was Ghaidaa Hetou from iStrategic for the Geoeconomics Podcast. Thank you very much for your time today, Ghaidaa.
Thank you so much, Alexa. It was a pleasure to be with you.
That was Ghaidaa Hetou, founder of iStrategic International. You can find Ghaidaa on iStrategic.com, and you can also follow her on Twitter at iStrategic1. We will have links for both below. The Geoeconomics Podcast is brought to you free from advertisements by the Adrianople Group. The Adrianople Group is a business intelligence firm that specializes in economic zones and international trade issues. We provide a wide variety of services such as due diligence, data gathering, cybersecurity, and investment attraction. For more information, visit adrianoplegroup.com or look in the description below. Thank you very much for listening to today's episode of the Geoeconomics Podcast.